Thank you all for making the transition from one Zoom meeting to another. I'm delighted to introduce Matt Gold, who will be moderating this panel, as well as Andreas Krause and Sebastian Lochen. I'm French. My colleagues and sort of the panelists will forgive my pronunciation. I will do my best. We also have Jakob Fossar-Petersen, who is on the screen. I will give a very brief overview of each of their current roles, then I will let them introduce themselves, and then we'll kick off the session in earnest. So for those of you who do not know Matt, he's head of legal transformation at Contract Pods. He is a Brit and used to be at the telecom operator Like a Mobile. I believe he's London-based, and he joins us from his home. And I think, like me, he's had to be careful because it's suddenly sunny in London and the lighting has gone all weird in my room. Jakob is corporate vice president and assistant general counsel at Novo Nordisk, which is the company I know many of you will be familiar with. He is also managing an offshoring team based in India. I have the pleasure of managing a very large team in India. It raises all sorts of challenges, especially over the last almost 2 years now, when travel has been impossible. And actually, when the pandemic started, I had some Indian colleagues who were with us here, both in our US and in our UK offices, and we had great trouble getting them home safely and reasonably as the travel bans all started kicking in. And Andreas Krause is general counsel for Delivery Hero in a global role in an exciting and fast-moving industry. And I very much look forward to his comments as well. Anila, if you're happy, we can start the discussion.
Anila, I think you're on mute, but yeah, Kevin, let's go ahead and jump in.
Yes, so we'll start with Matt, who'll be moderating this session. Thank you, Kevin.
Fantastic, Kevin. Thank you very much for that introduction, and great to have everybody on the line today. Yeah, so I'm.
We lost Matt there
for Contract Pod as well as being GC there. So really sort of working with clients how they can actually go on that transformation on that transformation journey is something that I spend a lot of time talking to people about, and it's about solving the kinds of issues that I've had with teams that I've been running over the years, and now trying to help other people solve those problems. Maybe before I ask the panel to sort of just give a little bit more introduction about themselves, I was just going to say, just start with a few statistics. By 2025, legal departments will increase their spend on technology threefold. It's Gartner stat, another Gartner stat. Legal departments will have automated 50% or so of their legal work related to major corporate transactions. At least 25% of spending on corporate legal applications will go to non-specialist technology, so using technology that we probably already have. And again, and this is really what we're going to talk about during this session, is that by 2025, Gartner believes that only 30% of the potential benefits that could be gained by using technology will actually be being gained by most organizations. So clearly a long way to go on the journey. So it's that journey, I think, that we're going to be talking about a little bit today. So on that, no further ado, if I could ask my fellow panelists to just introduce themselves and say a little bit about their interest in this area and their experiences. And maybe, Jakob, if you'd like to go first.
Thank you very much, Matt, and thanks for being here today. I think it's fantastic that we can have a conference, even though it's virtual. So hope we can all benefit from that, and I'll try to lend my perspective. As Kevin mentioned, I head up litigation and legal operations at Novo Nordisk, which is a relatively large pharmaceutical company. I would say legal operations for us started 3 years ago. It took some time to sell the idea, but we've now had a team around for 2 years. I think we are still building a little bit as we go, but we also have a few key wins that we can put on our tombstone. We have focused a lot on creating progress within areas where we have either large pain points or can see relatively early wins. So external counsel management and contract management have been 2 areas we've been focusing on a lot, and a lot more to come. And I hope we can get back to that later in this session.
Thank you, Jakob. Sebastian.
See if I can get this working now. Thank you, and sorry for being late. Sebastian Lochen, I'm the Group General Counsel and Chief Compliance Officer for ThyssenKrupp. The group is roughly 100,000 employees. It's a traditional German steel production company, but has evolved since. Maybe you heard that we sold our elevators business last year for roughly 17 billion, which was quite a large transaction. We're building everything from German submarines to cement plants to, but also trading in metals, etc. So it's a rather big conglomerate, which is the background against which we are working in these legal operations environment. I've been the Chief Compliance Officer since 2018, always in compliance more or less, and therefore quite used to actually using tools for business partner screenings, our whistleblowing system, which we've just talked about in the breakout session. So I think for compliance departments, it's not so unusual to use these tech tools if you want. For legal, it's a bit more complicated, maybe also because of the very different subjects that we're dealing with. It's different if you're working with OEMs or with states as your customers, etc. But there are some basic elements that I think legal departments can profit from. As Jack was saying, operations is something where you can have some easy wins, I think also. And what we're looking at challenges is looking for knowledge management, contract management, and things like that, because it's always a trade-off between decentralized organization and centralized tools. So I think we have a chance to talk about that challenge also.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. And Andreas.
Yes, hello. My name is Andreas. Thanks for having me. I work for Delivery Hero. It's a tech company that delivers anything, but also runs virtual kitchens and restaurants and also virtual convenience stores. It's a fast-growing company, and we have recently been introduced into DAX also in Germany. And I lead the legal team here. So it's basically the corporate M&A team. Then there's a capital markets team, commercial regulatory team with antitrust, disputes and labor law, and commercial operational team, which focuses on software, IT, IP, and general operational questions. And there's also a small legal tech, legal ops setup that we have introduced just about a year ago. Also, I lead then governance, risk management, compliance, and public policy and government affairs. And our focus with legal tech basically is to gain and increase the efficiency, because as mentioned, our environment is growing very fast, and it's a challenge to keep abreast basically with a business.
Thank you, Andreas. And maybe actually I'll just ask you to just sort of expand a little bit on that, Andreas, in terms of the key areas, obviously talking about efficiency within your organization, but what areas of legal tech are you actually looking at and you working on getting into your organization to sort of help drive that?
Yes, sure. So basically it's automation to a good extent. So we try to introduce automation wherever tests are repetitive and maybe do not even have to be performed by the legal department per se, but by a robot basically. So what we, for example, have introduced is for our long-term incentive program, we do have quite a number of beneficiaries, and basically we went into automating the subscription process because the documents, they're really the same. And maybe it's the amount of RSUs the person can subscribed to. There's a different name, there's a different date, and minor things like that, but nothing that should be performed by the core legal department, really. Then the next one would probably be data consolidation. So we are trying to work towards a single source of truth for all of our legal matters and contracts. The team in Berlin is already quite big. It's overall 130 people, half of which are working in the core legal function. But then we have twice as many people roughly around the globe. And hence it's really important for us to have this single source of truth and similar templates, obviously amended for the relevant jurisdiction, but on the higher level, let's say, it should be similar. And lastly, also we try to centralize or at least provide visibility on the legal operations to the entire wider legal team globally. So we don't necessarily need to centralize the processes, but rather it's on the visibility so that we can collaborate as efficient as possible.
Thank you very much indeed for that. That's some really interesting examples of where to focus. And Jacob, where is your organization currently focusing your efforts?
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Maybe I should clarify that we always look at this sort of as a three-way assessment. One is the IT tool in itself, what that can do for us, but also given that we think a lot of the tools out there are still relatively immature. That's only one component out of three. We then also look to the processes, the way we work, because it's always sort of the case that when we are introducing a new tool, it has to be in combination with a set way of working. And so far, or in the past, legal has not been super good at sort of putting down on paper what it is we do. So there needs to be a process. And then lastly, and importantly, is our own human capital. Are we even able to make use of these tools according to the process we then described? So only when we see that we can leverage an IT tool in combination with a way of working and that we are actually able to do it also out in the markets. We have 300 lawyers around the world and they're working in a very hard and fast-paced environment, many of them. So it has to be super simple, the technical solution. So if those three parameters come out and we can see a benefit, then we go for it. And that's where we apply this 80-20 approach, that we go for either alleviating a key pain point or harnessing one sort of big opportunity. And the two biggest wins we've had so far is within our management of external counsel. And that fulfills all three criteria. So there is a tech tool, but there's also an established process. And we have upskilled ourselves to be able to leverage the tool and the process. And by that, we have actually achieved a 20% cost reduction. And since external counsel management is taking up between 40 and 50% of our global spend, it's actually a huge win on that dimension alone. The other big piece is on contract management, where we've implemented a new tool, but also a new process. And we've been able to decrease the time spent on our key contracts by close to 80%. So it also gives you an indication of where we were coming from if you're able to reduce it that much. But that is not the tool alone. It's also basically drastically diminishing the contents we put into our contracts. So those are two key areas that fulfill those criteria. And then we have many more projects, but I think those are the two biggest ones so far.
Thank you, Jay. And I think one of the, when we were talking previously, I think that it's the fact that by thinking about it in that way, thinking about it in such an organized way, thinking about the processes, actually the outcomes that you're seeing already, an 80% reduction in time is really impressive, and takes so much man hours and so much crud out of the system. So I mean, it really is that by putting that effort in a logical, thoughtful way, you really can see the benefits. Maybe Sebastian, I think your experiences and where you've been focusing.
Yeah, as I said, coming from compliance, the focus in the past years was getting systems running there, which means a third-party due diligence tool that we implemented, or a whistleblowing system that is quite automated in a way that you have documentation, etc., that you have a web surface, etc. It's nothing super advanced, but it's I think state of the art. So what we're looking at, if we're looking at tools, it's as easy to implement as possible, which means obviously cloud-based, etc. But with 300 subsidiaries plus, it just needs to be easily accessible on the one hand side by our legal colleagues, compliance officers, but also by the business. So that's very important that we get buy-in at a very early stage, because it doesn't make sense that we think a tool would be handy and necessary, but it's in the best instance it's driven by the business, because or our business close to the business legal colleagues, because then they have an advantage from it. Yeah, typically it's going to be a big change process, because even for NDAs, what a typical lawyer would do is search their old emails for the latest version they used, and then just use that on the next case, right? But that's, as Andreas said, a single source of truth for these kind of things would obviously be very helpful, and that's one thing that we're going to look into.
Fantastic, thank you. And just before, actually, we'll talk about user, how you got a buy-in for user adoption in a moment. But before we do that, maybe let's just do a bit of a panel question, or sorry, a poll question to the audience first, just to see just to get the sense from our audiences about where their organizations are. So this is a single choice. So is your organization still thinking about it? Haven't really started on your digital transformation journey? Are you somewhere along on the journey? Maybe you're pretty in a good place, or are you fully digitized? So
great, we're getting some answers coming through. I'll give it another 5 seconds before I end the poll and share the results. Yeah, still waiting for a few people to give their answers in.
It's all anonymous, we don't know.
Yeah, perfect. So I will now launch and share the results.
Thank you.
And there we have it.
Thank you. Actually, that's very, very interesting results. And but before I give my views, let's ask the panel to give their thoughts. How does Jacob, maybe how does that sort of chime? Is that what you would have expected from your organization, also talking to colleagues in the industry?
Yeah, I can say I think actually our organization is somewhere in between A and B, also because we have a lot of focus on the processes and getting those right before we can even implement the IT tool. So I actually think this looks pretty impressive if this is really where people are. I'm quite humble about, even though we've done quite a few things, I still think we have a lot of a way to go. So we are in between A and B. I think we are.
Thank you. No, I will talk about a little bit more, but I think it's your focus on process, which from my experience, also from working with clients, implement that if you've done the homework, got the processes, it's a great way to start. Sebastian, your thoughts?
I was trying to press, but I was not allowed, right? So
no, we don't know what you thought. You're not allowed to vote.
Yeah. I would have done the same thing, probably. B, tried to push B, but it's true, as Jacob's saying, somewhere between A and B. But I'd be really interested in the two companies that are fully digitalized or digitized. That would be really interesting to see. Maybe even though it's anonymous, if you have everything ready already, that would be interesting. Join the discussion, please.
That's a very, very good point. What is fully digitalized, but to be fully automated, it does show that some organizations really have got there and have been on this journey, and the benefits, hopefully, that those organizations are seeing can lead us all to aspire. Andreas, your thoughts on where your organization is in relation to this poll, and your thoughts on the results.
Yeah, we are probably also about 20% into the journey. So I think it's really telling to see that almost 90% of all companies are really thinking about this process. And it's encouraging to see that some people are already very advanced, as mentioned, even fully digitized, or like halfway, 3/4 through the process. So yeah, I think this will become more and more important for the next years to come.
I think you're absolutely right, and it does show that you know some people have been obviously at this for over 2 years, which is good, because really this is a journey, and obviously that's what we're talking about today. So maybe just moving on, we were talking a little bit about user adoption. I think, Sebastian, you sort of referred to it specifically in your last, but maybe just give us a little bit of a thought, maybe I'll go at you, Sebastian, in terms of the approach that you took to actually get user adoption. I think that's a thing that we see a lot of clients have, is how do you get the buy-in in the first place, both for your own teams, for the wider organization, and we all know that change is tough, and you know, lawyers are not necessarily always the kinds of people who love change and love technology. So how do you what are your tips and thoughts, and how did it work for you?
Well, the first thing is that in an ideal world, the drive for a new process or new tool comes from the business, or from at least from the legal colleagues advising in the business, right? Because then the additional or added value is seen by those who are going to be using it. It's I think the worst approach is to tell everybody we want and need this because the board says so. And if you've gotten across this point because everybody thinks or many people think it's helpful, then as soon as possible early in the implementation, we need the users on the team that develops the solution. Because as I think Jacob said, or Andres, I don't know, the tools that you can get on the market are probably good as they are, but they need to be heavily customized to fit into the processes this group has, or the processes have to be streamlined first. Probably both is true, but in any case, we need a customization and implementation team, and that is for sure not only the people in the central department, but even more so the ones who are going to use the tool. And so I think for us in the past, for example, with our third-party due diligence tool, it's been a good success because everybody could bring their ideas to the table, specifics of their business, what kind of questions do they need in addition, etc. And then it's easy to get into the multiplier role because they are convinced, and then they can convince their people. And it's, I think, very important also not to only use or include the bosses of the teams, but those who actually do the work.
Fantastic, thank you for that. And I did remind that your comment on the board resonates. There was one of our clients, very successful implementation. In fact, the GC decided to hand over the decision-making process. Obviously, he was still controlling the budget, but actually the decision-making process of which supplier the team wanted to go with was ultimately decided by the people who would ultimately be using. And I thought that was a very interesting approach to take to get buy-in at a very early stage. Jacob, just give your thoughts on the approach that you've taken to get the buy-in.
I would say it's a challenge and will be throughout. I think not to paint a bleak picture, but I think you need to have pretty thick skin if you work in this environment. And I also used to head up compliance for a number of years, our group compliance function. And it's an area where you can draw on a lot of the experiences, I think, because also there you really need to be in it for the long run. But we started out with actually showcasing this to management, but also a broader group by bringing in people from other organizations that were further ahead. So instead of bringing in people who wanted to sell us something, then hear from somebody who has already done it or at least ahead. And with that, we're actually succeeding in sort of setting up the team and getting the key resources in place. And then I think maybe it was not super smart, because I do relate to what Sebastian is saying. We took sort of a centralistic approach because we needed to push the contract management system. So we actually said we needed this and implemented that. But I think it was still very abstract for people what it was. Everybody would like to work smarter. And now we're gravitating more towards this approach that you also were referring to, Sebastian, that we actually engage more with the customers and have them define, either in legal or in line of business, what it is they would like to see improved. So they're sort of on the journey in even creating the idea and developing the project, instead of us having figured it all out and then trying to sell it to them after. So going more with the flow of where people's interest is, and then catering to that. But I think it's tricky when you start out. Then I think there also has to be somebody saying where are the sort of major wins to be had, and drive that. But you get a lot more momentum if you can get some champions out there who actually want you to develop something for them, and then you cater to that.
And Jacob, just while we're thinking that in fact one of our audience asked the question, and I think I picked up on it earlier. You were also talking obviously about the process changes, which obviously really improved your the efficiency of the organisation. But obviously to get the users to buy into that, but also to actually change your processes. What would you say was the key thing that you did and you focused on in order to achieve such an obvious improvement in output and efficiency?
Yeah, I mean, specifically how we arrived at that was we did all the hard labor, but essentially we took out a lot of waste in the process, right? But I think what we are doing more and more, and where I see we actually get momentum, is we try and engage more in getting the ideas, but then we quickly build something so people can relate to it, because a lot of this is very abstract to people. So you need to build something, and then you need to communicate, and do it very visually. So if you can sort of showcase, this is where we are today, this is where we would like to go, and this is what it will mean for you. Or maybe now we've created a prototype, and this is what it was before, and this is what it is now, and what is the saving or the value add. Then people understand it, and then they embrace it. So build something quite fast, it makes it less abstract, and then showcase it and scale from there. I think we're going to do a lot more of that. And then I'm repeating myself, but never underestimate communication. You can never do enough there. And engage also one-to-one with people out there. You cannot just sit in the central project office and issue newsletters and all the good things you're doing. You need to be able to demonstrate the tangible value. No,
I couldn't agree with you more, Jacob. That's fantastic advice. And Andreas, I think your experience and how you would add. I think although Jacob, I think summed it up with communicate. But Andreas.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we were at an advantage, or are at an advantage, to the effect that the company is still quite young and people in general are interested in tech tools and tech solutions. So we don't have established processes that have been run for decades and need to be changed fundamentally, but can rather implement something new where it's still easy to point at the benefits. But nonetheless, I think change management in general was obviously also our challenge, because people do have their own ways of working, and it is difficult to influence that behavior and change it. And the other one was process mapping and integration. So various legal functions might have quite different processes. And then it's a challenge basically to map out a process that then translates into that software and basically deals with everybody's issues. And if you look outside of the legal department, then there might be even competing requirements. So if we want to collaborate with procurement team, for example, it obviously also needs to fulfill the needs of such stakeholders. And the way we went about it was basically twofold. So first we started out at Central, and the process there was very inclusive, maybe not necessarily democratic, but everybody had the chance to voice their opinion and also look in detail into the different tools and even test them. So we involved these stakeholders so that we could address the requirements. And then we identified basically a set of, if you will, super users, or maybe you can call them champions, legal tech champions, who would promote the usage of the system within the respective departments, but also then really be part of the technical discussions on how to improve the system and how to make it work for that department. And then we sort of rolled it out at Central and revisited after a while whether it's suiting our needs, what needs to be further changed, and basically improved before we scale it globally. And now we are at the stage to roll it out globally with the learnings that we have achieved from our central perspective. And given that we are based in 50 different countries, we are going for the so-called train the trainer concept. So we have regional points of contacts who then will become the super users and train all the local entities on how to use it. It will be slightly less inclusive because we already are at a stage where we know which tool we want to run and in general also how we want to run it, but then we still need to take into consideration sensitivities of different countries, so be it language or particular requirements from these countries.
Andrew, thank you. I think there's some really good points to bring out there. The sort of starting small, building up, and taking the kind of phased approach, I think is it can be very successful. But also the trainer, getting the top down, and actually maybe just sort of taking on there. I think one of our audiences asked the question about quick wins, and we often see that actually that, you know, as part of that change management, getting a few quick wins, getting a few things that you can see up and running so that people can see the benefit can be a good way of taking people on the journey. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, Andreas, and also Jacob or Sebastian.
Well, it depends on the requirements or the pain points of each department, right? So, but as I mentioned, for example, if for the long-term incentive program, it takes considerable amount of time to sort of fill in the details, like contact details and the like of hundreds of beneficiaries. And if that can be automated, then that is a huge yeah, maybe also a quick win for the department. Then, for example, on signatures, wherever it's possible to get digital signatures rather than running around the department and maybe not even knowing where the management board currently is. So then it's much easier to get these signatures digitally. And yeah, it really depends on the particular pain points.
Fantastic, thank you. Jacob, any
yeah, I would say it could be almost anything. So rather than pointing to specific examples, it's more the way to get there. So one thing we did was we issued a time registration request. Lawyers hate that, right? They used to work at law firms. So now finally, when they get in-house, they get rid of that. But it was actually extremely helpful in pointing to where do people spend their time. And out of that, what is on pretty labor-intensive or recurring work. So there you have the data saying, here people are saying, I spend a lot of time here, but I actually don't think this is a key value add. And then you go and look for how can we then relieve you of some of that pain, right? And many times it's actually not rocket science or that you need a super fantastic IT tool. There are relatively easy ways often to then at least make life easier. So there again, the customer, as I see it, has identified the pain point or the need, and then you can have a discussion about how you can overcome that. And then actually a lot of it is pretty banal. And then it's just also relatively easy to do something about.
Thank you, Jacob. And Sebastian, your thoughts on sort of quick wins and how to and how to get get that buy-in.
So I think what Jacob just said is a really important thing that we use in compliance, not yet in legal, is to track what people are doing. That was exactly as you're saying. People coming from the law firms are not looking to fill in timesheets. We are not allowed to track times actually because we're German labor law is hindering us or for determination. But in any case, what we did is filling out sheets, and that's done in Excel, which is not IT. A fantastic IT solution in itself. It would be helpful to do it otherwise. We've postponed it, but for years now we are tracking the kind of advice we are giving to business, and then can filter it and sort it out by all kinds of regions and businesses and what have you, and by topic. And that is really helpful in all budget, FTE, and all those kind of discussions, but also in focusing on where do we want to invest into tools or invest into our processes, and where does it make sense or not? The thing is that sometimes you think it might be interesting to invest into a process because it's not really satisfying or enriching to answer the 400th time if someone can take an invitation or accept a gift of a wine bottle of 20 euros or so. On the other hand, implementing a tool for that would, in our analysis, create much more traffic to our desks than we have right now with a system where this is not necessarily come to our desk all the time. So we need to be careful what we ask for in that instance, because in the end, if you have a tool that says, well, any gift needs to be reasonable, and the tool doesn't provide an answer to what is reasonable, then every single question will land on someone's physical desk, and there we need to be careful also.
That's a very, very good point. I think let's take us to the second poll question that we have, which I think takes us a little bit to. There were some questions only about what do we consider to be fully digitized, and I think these were sort of some of the sort of grouping of all the sort of different areas that teams could be looking at. We've got one document repository, single source of truth, automated workflows, e-signatures. We've got a comment that obviously that e-signatures is obviously very key. They're getting in things like automated templates, playbooks, and as I think it was Sebastian was talking about, the long-term digitalization of a long-term incentive plan. And of course, then we'll get into the really advanced AI, sort of actually properly reviewing third-party contracts, use of playbooks, those kinds of things. So look,
I'm just going to wait another 5 seconds before I end the poll and launch the results. I can see quite a few people deciding on their answers.
And as we say, there's multiple choice.
The panelists cannot make any choices. It's only for the audience. So there we have it. And the results are interesting.
Bit of everything, but maybe the advanced AI maybe the sort of should we say more the maybe later down the line, which sort of leads me to sort of just to sort of to ask the panel where they and their organizations are thinking of going next, sort of bearing in mind the different areas we've got here, where their organizations currently are, but then maybe give us an idea of where you're heading in the next year, but also your thoughts on where you might be in the next 4 to 5 years. Maybe ask Jacob to start on that one.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. First of all, I think this corresponds with our organization's view in sort of doing first things first. So A to C is where we have also focused and already more or less completed that. The advanced AI is not to be IT skeptical, but I think it needs a little further maturation, and for sure for us to be able to embrace that. So that would also be in line with our thinking. Where to next? I think a lot is going to happen in the coming years. I'm really focused on getting a full-fledged knowledge management system. So that is more than a central repository, but ideally a system whereby all work product of the legal function is contained in one place. And thereby you would not only be able to find the advice you've done before, because you could get that from the repository, but also you would be able to extract data as to what your organization is actually doing. And that's a key point also, that as I see it in our organization, legal operations is the only unit that is quantitative. So actually using data, setting up goals, and sort of looking at how the organization performs according to the goals. So this means creating dashboards, tracking your performance is absolutely key. So when you have data, then you can get much better discussions on where to focus. So getting the data is really key, and that's why a full-fledged knowledge management system would be absolutely key for us to get to.
That makes perfect sense. And Sebastian, where do you see things in terms of how does this relate to your organization and what you're thinking of automating your journey over the next year or two? And indeed, like Jacob, where do you see things going in the next 4 to 5 years?
Yeah, so we're also looking at contact management and knowledge management, and maybe one of the audience is asking similarities and differences between legal departments and legal firms. I think it's on the knowledge management side, I think there's some similarities, because you need to know what your company knows, even if people are leaving, or especially if people are leaving their email inbox behind, right? So ideally, you don't need to filter their email inbox to find something they were advising on. So knowledge management but it's also a very complicated part, that for sure. But definitely something I'm going to be looking into. And as Jacob is saying, AI and having fancy products, and also the same applies to me to things like blockchain. I'm happy if we have products that use AI or blockchain, or you name it. But I'm not looking into the technology. I'm looking into the product. If it's off the shelf, it's probably something we're looking for. And if it has AI and has a use case, then it's perfect. But I'm not doing it the other way around, to say I need AI in my company and then looking for a product where I can use it.
No, makes perfect sense. As you say, it's output. What is the best way to what is the goal you're trying to achieve? And I think that again, I think just from experience and talking to others, it is actually those teams that sort of, you think about your process, you think about the problem, and then how do you solve the problem? And if the problem is trying to get work out the legal team, it may be that AI is part of the solution, but it's not doing AI for AI's sake. And I think that's a very good, very, very good observation. And Andreas, just to round things up, your view of where you are, where your organization is going, and in 2 to 5 years' time, and also probably just also from your experience, one of our audience have also asked the question about how do you start in terms of local, you start at the center and work down, or start regionally and grow up? Maybe just want to touch on that as well in your opinion.
Yep, sure. So basically, as mentioned, we want to roll out the tool globally. So that's our next step. And also right now, it's only available to the legal function and procurement users. So we would like to establish then a single portal for all business users to go basically to request support from the department. And in the longer term, maybe in the best case, even to have like a Q&A section that could work with a chatbot. Apart from that, it's just the increase of the use of automation in the regular legal tasks. And to your question, how to start, also as mentioned, we started at Central and basically started with the pain points. Everybody was overworked, so we dug deep into the root cause of that and tried to map out what people spend their time with, and then make a best case scenario what they should spend their time with, and then try to find solution on how to achieve this goal. And automation played quite a big role in this.
Thank you. And look, there's one question I think we haven't touched on, but it was just for you, Jacob, I think from one of our attendees about where do you start collecting your data?
I mean, one example for us would be contract management, where we implemented this tool, but then actually one of my guys built in Power BI a system whereby we can track live who's doing what. So instead of just looking at overall numbers and adoption of the system, you can actually go in and see who does what, and then you can target those people. So we had a case where in Poland, we had slow adoption of the tool and the e-signature of contracts. And instead of addressing the whole organization, we could actually only make a phone call to 2 people. And then we were at 100% the day after, just by getting to those 2 people. We would not have been able to do that without that information.
Fantastic, Jacob. And look, sadly we are out of time, but I also want to thank the panelists, and I think that Jacob, Sebastian, and Andreas, and I think some wonderful insights. And yeah, I think that what it seems to me it's the journey, it's the thinking about the journey, and it's as much about the focus on the start of the journey as on the end, and making sure that you really have people have talked to their users and got the necessary buy-ins. And I think some great lessons for all of us in that. So just want to thank the panelists and hand back over to Kevin to introduce the next speaker. But thank you all very much indeed for your time.
And special thanks to Matt for moderating again.
Very much.
In this setting, it's always awkward. And thank you, Andreas. Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you, Jakob. Much appreciated. There were and there undoubtedly will be more questions coming through. please keep sending them. We will make sure they all make their way to the panelists, to the moderators, and everyone will do their best to answer them either in a public forum or directly with you. And without further ado, Anila, are we ready for the next session?
So welcoming Andrew to his session. So Andrew, you can begin.
Thank you, Kevin. Hi there, my name's Andrew Henderson. I look after the due diligence business at Refinitiv, which is part of the London Stock Exchange Group. Previously, I was running part of the business at the Red Flag Group, which was acquired by Refinitiv, so that's my background. And today, would have loved to be there in person, and hopefully we'll be back in live events in the near future. But today I wanted to talk about what we're seeing as some of the changes in the due diligence space, and primarily around how clients are now wanting to look more holistically at a due diligence program, rather than some of the historic programs which are much more focused on a single risk topic or risk area. So that's really what I wanted to manage today. And hopefully everyone can see my screen. I'll walk through some slides. Really what I talk about is what is due diligence? Some very basic discussions I'm sure everyone is well aware of. Whether in your business you're looking at due diligence for money laundering reasons or corruption reasons or any of the other many reasons that people are looking at. But talk a little bit about why we're seeing a need or a demand for more holistic due diligence, or what we're calling more holistic due diligence, and what that means, what we talk about when we're saying that, and why it's being asked of us, and why I think it's something that most people should be thinking about, or at least asking themselves questions about where they can go in that direction. Okay, so what is due diligence? A very basic point again. It's really about gathering the information to make a good decision.
Andrew, apologies, we can't see the slides. The slides aren't.
You can't see the slides? Okay.
There we go.
There we go. Okay.
Thank you.
Technical difficulties, as always, with these online reviews. So as I was saying, what is due diligence? It's really a data gathering exercise. And I think there's often a thinking around due diligence that it is a document or it is a report or a final product. And it's not really. It's a data gathering exercise. And it's a thinking process of risk assessment. And as you gather more information, you're sort of making continual risk assessments till you get to a point where you've got enough information. So that's really what I consider due diligence to be. It is a process. It's not a document or a piece of information. It's a process that you're going through. But what I think is changing is that process is gathering information on a lot broader set of risk areas than was historically. And what we're seeing, I think, is a lot of pressure from a lot of different places for us to do this kind of due diligence, or at least know about your partners, whether suppliers, customers, distributors, whoever it is that you're wanting to gather information about to make your decisions. There's a lot of pressure coming from a lot of different places. This was a survey that MIT put together. A lot of the pressure is coming from government, so that's all the regulators and the legislation that's coming down the track in a lot of areas. And that's certainly broadened out from the more traditional areas of corruption or money laundering. Companies themselves are putting pressure on themselves. So the executives are kind of starting to put together policies, codes of conduct, etc. Some of which is coming from industry, some of which is themselves wanting to do more CSR or ESG kind of work to get themselves into a position that they want to be. So the companies themselves are really driving a lot more of the due diligence processes and the onboarding processes for customers and suppliers. And that sort of leads to the third area of the source of pressure, which I think is going to be growing exponentially over the next few years, which is investors. And that's really the ESG topic. we're finding that that is driving a lot more due diligence than it certainly had in the past. And there's money behind it. So that's where I think a big difference is coming, that ESG due diligence might be a small part of what people are interested in terms of the decision making, but it's driving a lot of the need for it because executives can see the direct connection between an investment requirement, whether that's a direct investor or a passive fund or an index, if they're wanting to get investment, and an ESG program, of which due diligence is a part. So that's really where we're seeing the change. It's not so much being driven by a compliance function looking at a legal risk. It's being driven much more from executives coming down the business saying there are real business imperatives that require us to do a more broad review, and specifically at the moment it's very much ESG driven to have that, which has that connection with investors, and that's what I think we're seeing, and it will differ by business to business, but it's very much what we're seeing, which is a change from 2 years ago and even from a year ago. That driver for looking at ESG risk as part of a due diligence program just wasn't there before. In terms of what we were doing before, hopefully this isn't something that is a surprise for anyone who is doing the due diligence work. It was really finding out about the partner themselves. It was not necessarily basic, but it was looking at things like, are they who they say they are? So looking at ownership, looking at sanctions and ideas of whether you can actually work. Is there a regulator or a government saying you can't work in that industry or that location or with that particular entity? Looking at corruption and certainly in the in the sales channel, corruption was the #1 risk. Money laundering was the #1 risk in the client or the customer piece, especially for financial services, or source of wealth and source of funds. So those tended to be the areas that people were doing their due diligence in, or focusing their due diligence on, because they were very legal regulatory issues that they were being forced to do, not because the business necessarily wanted to do it, but because the obligations were being forced on the business, and the compliance function was working out how to meet those obligations and manage and mitigate those obligations. But what we're seeing now is very much, as I was saying, massive driver behind ESG. And it's, yeah, some of it is still regulation. So you have things like the modern slavery legislation in the UK and the rest of Europe. You have a lot of supply chain due diligence legislation in Germany and again, replicated across many other parts of the world. But the big one is investors, and that investment and sustainable investment. The amount of money that's now under indexes that have mandates around sustainable investment is enormous and growing every year. And I'm sure everyone sort of is seeing that themselves. But that produces a driver which wasn't there 5 years ago, 10 years ago, when people were looking at corruption or money laundering, because it was more seen as a cost to the business rather than a now very direct benefit to the business. If an ESG due diligence program can help the investment side and help the business show themselves as being more compliant with ESG standards, or having a supply chain management that makes sure they really understand the ESG compliance, it helps either get access to funds, be easier to divest, or just to get themselves into a position to sell themselves. So that's really the driver for a lot of the change in the due diligence practices now, because a lot of the other sort of historic risk factors like corruption and money laundering can actually fall under an ESG program. They're generally governance related topics. So that's where, you know, the whole kind of thinking about due diligence is almost getting flipped on its head, and it's being much more ESG due diligence rather than the more traditional versions. But beyond that, we're also looking at other risk areas, which for their own reasons taking enormous sort of prominence. One of them is cybersecurity. So certainly when you're working with your supply chain or anyone that has access to your own confidential information, private information, even more so. The cybersecurity impact is becoming part of that. It has been for many years as almost a separate activity. So that there's often a CISO or a vendor management team that's looking at cybersecurity. But what we're seeing now is a combining of that with the other more traditional or some of the newer areas. So cybersecurity gets brought into the overall mix, because what you're really wanting to do is look at in a supply chain, looking at a vendor holistically, for want of a better word, because you want to see, you're not going to look at the same cybersecurity review in the same depth if they're not holding data or confidential information. So you've got to look at what you're doing with that partner. You've got to look at the issues around that partner. And cyber is one of the potential issues, but it's only one. And we're definitely seeing people move away from silos of due diligence. Cybersecurity is often an outside-in kind of exercise, and then swaps into an inside-out, where you're actually looking at policies and you're getting questionnaires sent out to the vendor. But you only do that when it's really important. So putting it into the same risk assessment model is what we're seeing clients, and we're certainly advising clients to do, to say, if you're looking at a vendor, look at everything about that vendor. In some cases, that will include cybersecurity. In some cases, it won't. In the same way, in some cases, you'll be looking at corruption. In other cases, you won't. But trying to put it all together in a comprehensive review, and not forgetting areas like cybersecurity, or leaving them to be done independently by a totally separate team that's not involved in the overall review of a vendor or distributor or any of the partners that you might want to be working with. And lastly, financial. So again, another area that most of our clients have been doing credit checks, looking at risk of default, but independently. It's another one of those areas that has been very much a silo. So credit management has been, or whatever term in every business, would look at credit, but they wouldn't necessarily look at credit at the same time as they're looking at what the business justification is, or what some of the other risks are, because they tend to need, there's a huge benefit in looking at them all together. Credit is one of those areas that can have implications across other spaces. If you're seeing reduction in credit terms, reduction in the offering of credit to the particular vendor, you'll often see that correlates with either governance issues, product issues, or generally to the risk of other areas like corruption, because you're seeing a company that's in some kind of, or under some kind of a pressure. So again, that credit review by itself is important. You do want to make sure that you're going to get paid, or you want to make sure that there's continuity of service. But if you're looking at it at the same time, you can see weaknesses in one area might flow quite quickly into weaknesses in other areas, which is why a holistic review allows you to look at all of those factors at the same time, rather than finance saying the credit is okay, even though there's some weaknesses that might bleed into other parts of the business. And lastly, the operational risk, which is an area which traditionally has been left to the business. If the business thinks that they want to bring on a new supplier, from a procurement and a compliance standpoint, it's generally been nothing to do with them. It's been a business decision. But what we're seeing now is very much the justification and whether the particular company can do the job that they are being engaged to do has massive implications for many other risks. Money laundering is a good example. If you can't understand what the customer does, you can't understand why they get their money, you're very much in the money laundering risk area. Similarly with corruption, if someone has put a distributor or an agent in place and you can't see any experience in the role, it flags a corruption issue. So again, putting all of those risks together and saying that's not just a business risk, it really needs to be reviewed at the same time as we're reviewing everything else, gives you a better oversight of the reasons for any engagement, and helps you again make a decision which is based on all of the appropriate evidence that you need to gather. So that's really what we mean by holistic due diligence. It's looking across a far broader range of risks than just the one that you might have started off with historically, whether it's corruption, money laundering, or sanctions, or any of those more traditional risk areas. What we're trying to say to clients is look more broadly across your partner universe and use risk assessment to get you in a position to say, what is it that I need to be looking at for this particular supplier, vendor that you have? And that's really the focus, is we're consolidating. A lot of these were done by different groups. We're trying to say, let's get lots of different stakeholders who are interested in the results of a due diligence exercise to work together. So first of all, it helps with your onboarding process. It can be a far more streamlined process. The third parties are generally happier if all of the questions are coming in at the same time, but you're really looking at them in one place. There's been often a huge amount of replication across the different business groups, asking very similar questions to get to the nub of what they're really interested in. So that's where a huge amount of savings and efficiency in bringing all of these groups together, but also ensuring that the due diligence exercise does cover this broad range of risk areas to make an overall decision which will improve your decision making. And now we have a quick poll question to give everyone a second, really finding out where you are in this journey. So some of you will be at very early stages starting to think about a due diligence program. Some will be doing it ad hoc, so not really thinking about a process. It's just every now and then there needs to be some kind of due diligence, all the way through to having some of you will be in this kind of holistic mode where you are looking at all the risks and all the stakeholders at the same time. So if I can give you a minute to fill in your answer, I'd be very interested to see the results.
We have a few people making their choices right now. I will leave it a few more seconds, 10 seconds, and then I'll end the poll. Okay, so I'm just ending the poll now and sharing the results. There we are.
Okay, so that's good news. I think most of you, the 2/3, are somewhat through the process of having a due diligence process in place, but I think that it looks like most people still have to think through that sort of merging of stakeholders, getting everyone involved and having a single process. It's good that there are a number of you that have got to that point. I think that's certainly the maturity of our client base. We're starting to see more and more people think through that, mainly because of the efficiency they're getting from that process. And also the impetus that the ESG demands is helping. Again, having that direct link between financial reward and a due diligence program, I think, is making the world of difference for compliance and procurement teams to build up to what they need to have, rather than trying to sell a future risk avoidance program. Okay, so that's great information. I think I need to share my screen again.
We can see your screen.
You can see my screen? Okay. Okay, so just wrapping up, final thoughts, and happy to take questions after this. First of all, it's really for everyone to sort of think about their current processes and think about how the stakeholders are working in their current world. Obviously, every company is very different in the needs. Every company is different in the risks that they're exposed to. So the due diligence programs generally will look different. But I think it's worth at this point looking at how the due diligence programs are currently running, whether there is scope to consolidate multiple concurrent programs into a single holistic program, but also looking at whether there are new risk areas that really need to be added to programs. Again, mainly around the ESG world, potentially around cybersecurity, and thinking, if you're not currently looking at those, thinking where the risks might be in your vendors, in your suppliers, in your potentially your customers, and looking at really how you can go about combining that. It's quite normal for it to be a process where you start off very independent, because each part of the business needs to really look and understand what it needs to do. But once you've got to a certain level of maturity in each of those individual programs, there's certainly benefit in looking at how they can be combined, because almost every time I've helped clients look through that, there's enormous amounts of overlap and inefficient processes just by the fact that they're totally independent processes. But it does require those stakeholders to all agree on the need to change. So it is very much a change management process. Compliance often is leading that charge, because they have that oversight of the risk topics. But when we're talking about ESG and the investment led, it's often coming out of finance and procurement. So that's also a change in the stakeholder mix. Those are the groups now that really have much more say and much more sort of leverage in what those overall programs will look like. And then get on and build that or rebuild those processes in a much more coherent fashion. Okay, that was my my suggestion. Again, would have been great to have it in person, but very happy to take questions if there are any questions.
So Andrew, thank you very much. We do have some questions, mainly about outsourcing. I'll read out the first one. Would you recommend outsourcing these targeted due diligence areas to specialized providers, or do it yourself, as in keep it in-house?
Well, notwithstanding that I am an outsourced provider, obviously I'm going to say outsource it, but it really depends on the scale. If you're doing very few due diligence exercises and you're not covering topics that are outside of your knowledge, then it's perfectly reasonable to do your own due diligence. I think the areas that would lead you outside of your own work is languages. So if you're a global business and you're working with partners all around the world, you do need to do your due diligence in the language of the supplier or the partner. Secondly, some of those areas like cybersecurity and credit do need specialist data sets. So if you're not going to outsource the overall process, then you need to still look at the data sets that you're going to need yourself to help you do that review. So definitely parts of it can be done internally. The benefits of doing it internally are that you will have access to the people who actually know the partner, and they know what the partner is doing for you or proposed to be doing for you. So you need that part of it pretty much anyway. So whether a provider gives you the raw data in a report and then you add to it with the internal knowledge, or you do it the other way around, you still don't want to outsource everything, because the external partner is just not going to know that business knowledge. But I think it comes down to scale and the languages and the resources and the access to resources.
Thank you, Andrew. And we've got a more complex question. In terms of new and non-traditional risks, what changes is Refinitiv making to its approach around information gathering? And there's an expectation from the person asking the question that there will be less publicly available data points on some specialist area like ESG. And that questions on those sort of more specialized topic will have to be more informed and targeted at the right function with the subject company, the company that's being reviewed. And my apologies to the person who sent the question if I've read it badly.
No, I think I understand the question. I think there's definitely a need to have different sources of data. So the traditional sources of data will give us some of that. So media research, sort of database research, business intelligence research is still going to be the basis of a lot of the data gathering. So media research for Refinitiv, we're looking at the same media sources, but asking different questions. So looking at more ESG controversies in that area. But what has changed is that we're also working with specialized data partners. So for cybersecurity, we're working with a partner that focuses on cybersecurity and brings that kind of specialized content into the overall review, which, as I said, it can be done independently. So companies can engage with those data partners and get that data themselves, or come to a provider like Refinitiv. And we've already done that engagement, but it's definitely required us to go and find partners that had that specialized knowledge that a traditional due diligence company never had or kind of needed. So that's where we're going. We're looking at sort of special data. Credit is another one. There's credit bureaus who focus very much on that topic. ESG is slightly different because Refinitiv itself has a massive ESG practice, mainly for public companies and the investment and indices kind of business. But there is, you're absolutely right, there's a lot of the ESG data that is only available by the subjects themselves delivering that data, and who we're asking the questions of has differed. But again, that's the same process that we've been going through previously, where we're gathering information directly from the subject. It's just the questions and the sourcing of those questions has changed, but the same process and the same thinking is underway.
Thank you very much, Andrew. We possibly have time to squeeze in one more question if there's one from the audience. Otherwise, we are bang on time. Thank you so much for a very timely and very informative session. Anila, I cannot see any further questions coming in, so we can probably close there. Thank you again, Andrew.
My pleasure.